So good evening, everyone. Just those of you who don't know, when you prostrate, the teacher always prostrates to the throne. And the idea is that you kind of want to hold the Buddha's teachings in some great esteem. It's all just about working with our minds, just so you know, if you don't know what a prostration's all about. So tonight's topic is making the mind spacious. And Margaret's informed me that Wednesday night is usually a meditation night. So we will be doing a fair amount of meditation as part of this. And I thought we'd start with just a short meditation. It's always nice to begin a gathering like this with at least a chance to focus our minds a bit, to let go of whatever distractions we might have from the day, anything that we're carrying with us, to be able to set that aside and to focus the mind. So just find a comfortable meditation posture. I'll give you a little guidance on that if some of you might be new to meditation. First and most important is to have the back straight. So we don't overly straighten the back by elongating the body or anything. We just simply find that place where the spine is naturally upright. A place where we don't need to hold a lot of tension in the body to keep ourselves in this posture. A place where we also can relax into this posture. So besides the back being straight, a few other elements of posture are the hands. You can place the hands wherever they're comfortable in your lap. The traditional posture is with the palms up, the right on top of the left and the thumbs together. And just allow them to be cradled in your lap. The head is upright, just on top of the spine. You can tilt the head forward slightly if you'd like. Tuck the chin in just a bit. And this will cause the gaze to go downward. You don't want the eyes fully open, but you ideally don't want them fully closed either. Just kind of a little bit of light coming into the eyes. But if this is uncomfortable to do, you can certainly close the eyes. And just a couple more elements of posture. One is to make sure that the mouth and jaw are relaxed, that you're not clenching the teeth. And if you can, it's nice to gently place the tongue on the upper palate with the tip of the tongue just behind your two front teeth. And then bring some awareness as well to any places where you find that there's tension in the body. Make sure that you release any tension you might have in the forehead or around the eyes, the neck and the shoulders. Sometimes we have a tightness in the chest. If we can release that, if that's there, let's try to soften into that area. And then also the lower abdomen and lower back are sometimes places where we tense up the body. And then maybe scan the body to see if there's any other places where you need to have that kind of softening. Bring your awareness there and just allow yourself to release any tension. And another technique to just let go of any other stress that we might have in the body is just to breathe in very deeply. And I like to suggest to people, when you breathe in, to feel that you're expanding every cell of the body. And then when you breathe out, feel that everything just kind of naturally contracts, releasing any tension, any stress, any worry, any anxiety. So maybe do this on your own if you wish, just a couple of deep breaths. So to begin the formal meditation, what we're going to do is focus on the breath. So I'll just give a little bit of instruction on that. Most of you, again, probably already have some techniques for meditating on the breath. And if you have a particular technique that you use, that you prefer, you can use that. Otherwise, tonight I'm going to suggest working with this point at the tip of the nose. As you breathe in and out through the nostrils, just tune into that very subtle sensation that occurs towards the tip of the nose. And once you find that, then try to stay present as you inhale, as you exhale. Just trying to stay with that sensation that occurs just right inside the nostrils or near the upper lip. Wherever you find that there's sensation as you breathe in and out through the nose, just stay present with that. And that's the main instruction. But the secondary instruction is needed because we probably won't be able to stay with the breath for that long. Inevitably, the mind will wander, will get distracted, may even get kind of sleepy, foggy, because we're meditating in the evening. Whatever happens, and we notice that that's occurred, that we're no longer with the breath, then we simply let that go and bring the awareness back to the breath. So I'm going to ring the chime, and we'll just do this in silence for a number of minutes, just to focus the mind a bit, and then I'll lead you in just a short reflection that begins this exploration of the topic that I'll be talking about tonight. So now what I'd like to invite you to do is first to examine a situation in your life recently, one that you would consider to be negative. And maybe you don't have to choose something that was huge for you, but something that was an unpleasant experience. And maybe your mind got somewhat angry or upset, jealous or greedy, just some sort of manifestation of that type of what we might call a negative state of mind. And just recall it and be an observer of it. You don't have to experience it all again right here. But just think about what was going on at that time. And in particular, I want you to ask the question, what was my mind like at that time? And just see what words come up for you. It doesn't have to be a lot, just a few. How would you describe your mind at that time? Another question that might feed into that is, how did you feel? If you had to put a label on that feeling, what was it that you had as a felt experience being in that state of that negative mind? And now in contrast, recall an event recently in your life, a situation where you felt very positive, some experience that you would identify in that vein. Think of who you were with, what was going on. And here too, try to come up with a few words that answer that question. What was my mind like at that time? How did I feel? What was my felt experience? And then let's conclude this introductory meditation by simply determining that we're here tonight, each of us, some of us certainly with perhaps our own motivations, our own intentions, but to try to create the most positive intention that we can for being here. Whatever you might already have as a motivation, to try to think that you're here not just for yourself and to take care of your own mind, to learn how to make the mind more spacious. But you're here also because how you are in the world does impact others. And to think that you're here so that you can be at your best in the world, to help others to do the same, to help others to have a more enriching experience, a more wholesome and beneficial experience. Oh, a few more people came in since I started the meditation. Good. All right. So, let me give you a little bit of background before I do want to get some input from people in terms of what came up for you in looking at this meditation on the mind and what was happening with your mind at those two different points in time. But first I want to just introduce this topic. This is part, actually, the last time that I was here, I did two of these as well. Some years ago in Santa Fe when I was had been teaching for a few years, but I tended to teach very closely to texts and kind of rely upon a whole lot of notes. I still rely upon notes, don't get me wrong, but I wanted to really explore things that was maybe taking Buddhist teachings in a very practical way. Just kind of, what does it look like if I'm going to follow a bit of what the Buddha said in terms of my daily life? And we developed a series, myself with the spiritual program coordinator at the time, put together a series that we called The Heart of Practice. And the idea being that it would really try to provide really practical advice on living these teachings. And this was one of the first ones that I did. The date on my original notes here is September 27th, 2007, almost 10 years ago. And I've done it a couple of times since then. And these, when I do these, they always are different. Every time I do one of them, they have, because I'm at a different place in terms of how I'm teaching them. But when I first taught it, it was just an opportunity for me to get a bit out of the box and be a little more free form in terms of approaching these topics. And this one was really inspired by a wonderful quote from the founder of our organization, Lama Yeshe, who many of you know of. And there's a number of his free books in the back there. I think probably the one that I'm going to refer to. That was it was initially two different volumes. One was called Becoming Your Own Therapist, and the other is Make Your Mind an Ocean. And now they're combined into one single volume. And it's the teachings on Make Your Mind an Ocean that really inspired this topic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Lama Yeshe said in that book, because I think it's important to kind of bring that in. But my wanting to do this type of class was to explore, well, what does that mean? When Lama Yeshe says, make your mind an ocean, I mean, it almost makes it sound like it's just too big to fathom. And then I had this really wonderful story that, well, I call it wonderful. You can be the judge of it, I suppose. That was in one of the first, actually the first Tibetan Buddhist book that I read. In 1992, this book was published. Many of you have heard of it, The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sogyal Rinpoche. And I had the good fortune, after reading that book in 1993, of going on retreat with Sogyal Rinpoche and taking refuge with him. And I started with his organization. He's a wonderful teacher. And he has this really interesting story that starts to be chapter 4 on the nature of mind. And this story apparently he heard from Patrul Rinpoche, or Patrul Rinpoche gave it to his teacher. But anyway, this is the story of an old frog who lived all his life in a dank well. One day, a frog from the sea paid him a visit. "Where do you come from?" asked the frog in the well. "From the great ocean," he replied. "Well, how big is your ocean?" "It's gigantic." "You mean about a quarter the size of my well here?" "Bigger." "Bigger? You mean half as big as my well?" "No, even bigger." "Is it as big as this well?" "There's no comparison." "That's impossible. I've got to see this for myself." They set off together, and when the frog from the well saw the ocean, it was such a shock that his head just exploded into pieces. The end. Okay. A really interesting story, right? That's not obviously the type of experience I want you to have tonight. But I do want you to kind of open to this idea that our minds are so far beyond what we've experienced, so far beyond the potential that we've given them, perhaps, and the limits that we put on them, and the idea that our minds do have an unbelievable potential. And they even say a limitless potential. So this is kind of the starting point for this teaching in terms of why I wanted to explore this subject for myself, as well as why I want to share this subject with you. So any input from the meditation in terms of when you were having the negative experiences, or recalling those, and what that was like for the mind, any labels that you'd put on the mind, descriptions of the mind at that time? Anybody? Angry, okay.
Like fixated.
Fixated.
Constricted.
Good. You guys are saying all the right words. Get gold stars. Any more? Yeah. Yes.
Mine was jerky.
Jerky. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Frustrated.
I'm sorry?
Frustrated. Frustrated.
Oh, frustrated. Yeah. Sorry, couldn't hear from the back. Yeah, good. Frustrated is a good one. Yeah. Other ones, other comments.
Depressed.
Depressed. It's a big one.
Misunderstood.
Misunderstood. Good. Any others?
Defensive.
Defensive.
And cloudy.
Cloudy. Good.
Victim.
Victim. These are all describing the experiences very well. Yeah. Anyone else?
Helpless.
Helpless. So we got a lot of ways of talking about this state of mind, and they all have that kind of connotation of something, first of all, undesirable, not something that we're like, nobody said comfortable, right? Nobody said, delicious, delightful. So, you see that they're on that end of the spectrum. They're all kind of talking about something that is an unpleasant experience. And a lot of the words that were shared too were these things around like kind of constricted, fixated. It's just kind of speaking to that narrowness of the mind that occurs when we have those negative experiences. And all the other things are fitting right into that in terms of they fuel all of that and keep the mind kind of in that collapse state, in that very tight, narrow state. Let's look at the other side. What were some words that you came up with to describe how you felt, the felt experience, the state of mind, if you wanted to describe the mind when you were in a positive situation? Anyone?
Peaceful.
Peaceful.
Spacious.
Open, spacious,
And clarity.
clarity. Wonderful.
Satisfied.
Satisfied.
Joyful.
Joyful. Big one.
Happy achievement, good achievement.
Yeah, good. Good achievement. Yeah. Something we take pleasure and delight in. Yeah. Any others?
Proud.
Proud. Good. Proud's a good one.
Vivid.
Vivid. Good.
Open heart.
Open heart, yeah. So a lot of these words, again, too, have that kind of connotation of not taking it to a constricted, tight, narrow level, but much more open, spacious, not bound in the ways that the mind is when we were talking about the negative experience. It might sound like a simplistic exercise, but frequently we just go into these experiences without sort of checking up what's going on with our minds. And part of what I want to share, and I'm going to go into this in a lot more detail this weekend when we do this little mini course, mini retreat on letting go and kind of breaking free of these harmful habits that we've induced in our minds. There's a really interesting book by a researcher, a psychologist who's a researcher in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which I guess is a really interesting area. There's a lot going on there in terms of investigating behavioral sciences and neurobiology and all these kinds of things. It's quite the up-and-coming area for a lot of that. Her name is Barbara Fredrickson, and she wrote this book called Positivity. And it's all about a theory that she has, which we can test for ourselves. And even just by recalling these experiences, we can see that there's some validity to this theory. The theory is called the Broaden and Build theory. And we can see it as being like a spiral. So the spiral, it's not like the spiral cord that's on a notebook or something that's all the same dimension all the way through the whole spiral. Rather, we're talking about a spiral that as we spiral downward, it becomes tighter and tighter and tighter. Whereas if you start building upward into the more positive realms, it becomes bigger and bigger and broadens the mind. It's just kind of a real basic way to talk about what is going on in terms of the quality of our thinking and the influence of positivity on the mind versus negativity on the mind, but then also how the mind influences what is arising, because it's always kind of dual-sided. You never have the mind sort of separated from the contents of the mind. The contents of the mind influence the mind influences the contents of the mind. And this is a bit of the trick behind it, is that we do have to begin to be kind of in the driver's seat to recognize that we can have control over this process. When all of you were recalling these various experiences, most of us, things come into our lives. We have a positive experience, we get all wrapped up in it and caught up in it, and then immediately something comes in that's negative, we get all caught up and tight around that. These do have an effect on our minds, but our minds can be in the driver's seat in the sense. We can actually choose to have more positive states, even in the midst of things that are arising that we might not normally be reacting in that way. And this is, again, a bit of what we're going to look at this weekend. But her whole teachings are really supporting, or this theory that she's come up with in the book that she wrote a book called Positivity, and it explains in more detail the effects of a positive state of mind on us as human beings and going about our lives. But it does definitely give us a lot more ways to make it workable. When we start introducing positive states and positive thinking, they have an expansive effect on the mind. The more expansive our minds are, the more we entertain ideas of creating more positive experiences. It kind of, again, reinforces each other. Neither one of these are completely isolated from the other. The mind and the experience that the mind is having, the thoughts that are being induced, and so on. So, in terms of our spiritual practice, and again, that word spiritual, I mean, spiritual in essence, this is I'll talk a little bit more about what Lama Yeshe says in his book. He says what spiritual really means, it means to search for, to investigate the true nature of mind. Spiritual means the mind, and spiritual people are those who seek its nature. So this is where we have to kind of acknowledge that in Buddhist terms, and what the Buddha taught, what we're always working with is trying to be aware of our minds and work with our minds. To do two fundamental things, which are tying very much into that spiral: to reduce the negative tendencies that we have, to stop that spiraling in and that narrowness and that fixatedness and that tightness and that constriction, because it's not a healthy place to be. In that state of mind, we aren't going to make the best choices. We're going to be subject to being angry, to being frustrated, to having depression. All these kinds of states of mind come from that tightness, that narrowness. Whereas, if we introduce the positive states of mind, which is the other main task, reduce the negative, increase the positive, we become happier beings. We become greater sources of happiness and joy for others. We feel deeper sense of contentment within our own minds. So, again, that's in essence what a spiritual path is. That's in essence what any spiritual practice should be, is about reducing the negative states of mind that cause us to have those unpleasant experiences, cause us to be more difficult with others, harm others, inflict all kinds of stuff on others, and increase the positive ones that help us to be more complementary to the world around us, to embrace the joy that others experience and be a part of their lives in more positive ways. So a spiritual practice essentially entails that. And so when it comes down to, understanding our mind, our mental attitudes, our habits, our patterns, everything is really all grist for the mill. It's exactly what we need to be working with. And this concept, why I was kind of intrigued by this, is once more, Lama Yeshe, when he uses this term, he's really talking about the fact that when we make the mind into an ocean, when we kind of think about it in that much more vast way, we're sort of allowing for the possibility that there are deeper senses of well-being that we can experience than what we have experienced in our more typical, narrow, tightly focused ways. So one of the tendencies that we have that kind of feeds into this is the tendency that we have to always be looking outside of ourselves for that to be the source of our well-being, or if it's the source of our misery, then we want to do everything possible to get it out of the sphere of our experience. So we're playing this game all the time of like trying to get all of this stuff outside of ourselves exactly in the right place. Does anyone know this game? This is how we spend most of our day, right? From the time we get up, we want to make sure that everything is just right, that the breakfast is prepared just perfectly, and that everything is taken care of so that we can leave home and do what we need to do, and hopefully the traffic is all going to go the way we want it to go, and we aren't going to have any accidents and everything. We were put so much faith on the outside world to make our day a good one, for us to be happy when we arrive at work or when we arrive home or whatever the case might be. We put all of this, actually John Landau, who I'm sure has taught here before, he calls this the if-only mentality. Like, if only that goes right, then I'm okay. And if only that's there, then I'm fine. And if only I get this, then I'm going to be just perfect. We put all this faith in all these things outside of ourselves, and our mind becomes like a yo-yo. Because we're continually going up when everything is wonderful and going along with our expectations, and then we're going down when everything is not to our expectations. And this is a bit of, again, that spiral and that tightening of the mind, that we get so narrowly focused on those things needing to be there that we can't accept the possibility of anything else. We're not flexible. We're not broad in our approach. We're not spacious. So this is a really interesting kind of perspective. And I have to give Lama Yeshe a lot of credit for teaching in this way. These teachings go back to the early days when he was teaching a bunch of hippies in Nepal and India and people who were just essentially, who knows what they were looking for, but they found something pretty amazing in these teachings. But he was really trying to get at this idea that there's a quality of mind that complements what we're trying to do in terms of breaking away from our dependency upon all that external stuff and trying to rely more deeply on ourselves, on our own state of mind as being the answer. If we can kind of hold that awareness of the spaciousness of the mind not tightening and getting all fixated on all these various things that we need to have for our happiness and well-being, then we'll be happier people. And we won't be harming people so easily. We'll just be much more carefree about our lives. Not that you become complacent and you just, don't care about anything. In fact, you're deeply invested in everything, but from the perspective of what is my mind doing right now? So when there's a traffic jam, when you were expecting to get to work 5 minutes earlier and now you're going to be 20 minutes late, then you work with that. You find a way to not let that bend you completely out of shape because the mind's more spacious, because you have more room for other options. So this is a really important concept, like I said. Let me read a few more quotes from Lama Yeshe. He says, if you know the psychological nature of your own mind, instead of being enemies and strangers, all living beings become your friend. The narrow mind rejects, wisdom accepts. So the idea here is that, again, if we are really clued into this, we're not going to be so set on pigeonholing everything that we meet. Oh, unpleasant person, pleasant person, neutral person, whatever labels we're kind of putting on people, we're not going to be doing that. We're going to look at everybody as coming from a place of equanimity, of equality, of a more balanced approach, so that then we once more don't get into all the trouble that we would if we're putting all these labels on people. As it says here, the narrow mind rejects, whereas the wisdom mind accepts. And it's just different ways of talking about this whole idea of breaking free of the sort of tightness, narrowness, rigidness, all of this that we put around the mind, and opening up to a different way of being in the world. And the one thing that's interesting about the mind is the mind does have that potential to become extremely spacious, to become all-encompassing, to become limitless in its potential. Why? Because it's not limited in the way that the body is. Maybe this is something I should have talked about a little bit earlier, but what is the definition of mind? What do we mean by mind? We're going to talk about mind tonight. We're going to do a little meditation on the mind. Does anyone know what the Buddhist definition for mind is? That which is clear and knowing. Okay, good. So clear is speaking about the nature of the mind from the point of view of it's not something material. It's not something that's substantial. It has clarity, luminosity. I often talk about the mind as almost being like a mirror that is simply reflecting whatever appears to the mind. But that makes it sound too inactive. The mind is also very active because it is responding and, of course, creating patterns in response to the world. But the mind is not something physical. It is simply a conduit for what appears to it to then be known. And this is the function of the mind. So it is that which is clear, that's its nature, that which knows or is aware of things, that's its function. So we have this amazing thing called the mind that most of us haven't investigated for a good part of our lives. But it's got the potential to be developed limitlessly. And why is that? Well, if we look at the body, His Holiness talks about this in some of his early teachings, we do have physical limitations, right? Physical limitations. Every year, or every 4 years, they have the Winter Olympics, and every 4 years they have the Summer Olympics, but they're off by 2 years or something. But every Olympics you have new records being broken, right? But is it going to be possible to have that be limitless? I mean, will somebody be able to pole vault the Eiffel Tower or something? I mean, probably not, right? There's probably limits in terms of what the human body can do. And we know this, again, just can be observed, be taken for granted. But because the mind is not physical, the mind is not the brain, the mind has that clarity, that luminosity, therefore the mind is boundless when it comes down to it. Now, does that mean that in this human body we can utilize the support of a brain to know everything? Well, the brain isn't what's knowing everything at the deepest level anyway. What is knowing everything is this phenomenon that we call mind. So the Buddhist concept of mind is a bit different than what we might think of in terms of our materialistic approaches to consciousness or awareness, which are equivalents to the word mind. This is a bit of a debate in terms of body-mind connection and where are the delineations between those. But in Buddhist terms, we would say there's a very definite delineation in that which is mind, meaning clear and non-material, cannot be matter, which is absolutely material, absolutely having that more substantial existence. So we have a bit of a separation between those two, and yet a complete interdependence between them. So in this human life, obviously, we've got our brains to help us in terms of being the processor, if you will, of all the data that's coming in through our 5 senses, as well as our thought processes. But all of that domain of experience, of knowing, is the mind, is this non-physical phenomenon. So His Holiness points out that this is actually why the mind can be developed to a limitless degree, is because it is not material. Because it's like space, the spacious nature, that space pervades everywhere, right? There's no place where space isn't. Even the space we're occupying, we still say there's space that we are occupying. Space is vast, can never be kind of delineated in a very kind of limited way. So the mind has the potential to become anything we want it to be in that regard, to know as much as we can know, to develop it as much as we can develop. But it's only going to do that, once more going back to the spiral, within the context of the broader approach. The mind can't be developed if we tighten it down to this very narrow level. So again, these are speaking to this quality that we're trying to become a bit more aware of in our practice, in our meditation, to really be sort of hanging out with that spacious quality of the mind. I want to do a little mini kind of, it's not really a game, but it's a sort of opposites game. And just, you can close your eyes if you want for this, but I'm going to say kind of certain words that evoke a more spacious nature, some of which have already been shared. And then I'm going to, in contrast, speak the ones that are on the more limited end, and just see what happens to your mind when you hear these words even. Because if you think about these words and bring their meaning to mind, you're going to have a bit of that experience. So what I'm going to do is I'll say like 1 or 2 words, and then I'll pause, and then I'll say the opposite, and then I'll say 1 or 2 words that are in the positive and the more spacious tone, and then I'll say the opposite. Okay, so we'll start. Spacious, unlimited. Constricted, limited. Roomy, boundless. Cramped, bound. Unconfined, open. Confined, closed. Wide, expansive. Narrow, contracted. Free, flowing. Restricted, solid. Light, clear. Thick, opaque. Groundless, sky. grounded earth. Now let's examine a bit of these opposites in regard to an ocean. Because again, Lama Yeshe used this phrase, make your mind an ocean. So I thought about the ocean for a while when I initially did this teaching, and thought of some of the contrasts of this in regard to the ocean. So again, we'll do the same exercise. So like the depths of the ocean, calm. Like the waves on the surface, anxious. Relaxing, releasing, tensing, grasping. Room for growth, trapped. Connection, separation. I mean, some of those weren't all about the ocean, but anyway. So we get a feeling for, again, the language that we're using around these is simply to evoke the sort of quality that we're trying to aim for in terms of how we make the mind spacious. We're going to talk a little bit about some tools to do that. That is part of what I want to, share with you tonight, as well as another meditation kind of working with the sky. And again, this is another one that's frequently used as sort of the sky-like nature of the mind in terms of that spaciousness. Let me see if there's any questions up to this point before I go on to talking a little bit more of some suggestions about how to work with this idea of making the mind more spacious. Any comments or questions? Criticisms? I'm open to criticisms. You don't have to fill out a form and put it in the suggestion box. You can tell me. Is everyone getting a feeling for this idea? I mean, it sounds like I said, at some level, it's a very simple idea, but it's a tool that we can have some awareness of that actually allows us to loosen up in the moment and to create more space in our minds. Because if we go back to once more where we started with these experiences, we see that there is a certain kind of felt experience that goes on when we're in a more negative state, when we have a situation that's confronting us, difficult for us. Whereas there's a very different felt experience when we have something that's positive. This is a bit of what I'm going to talk about on Friday night. Why do we define those as positive and negative experiences? Really, we can have a positive experience in our own minds regardless of that. And that's a bit of what we're going to go into on Friday night when we talk about learning to like problems. Is how do we start working with what we call problems and not make them into something that actually becomes a problem. It actually becomes an amazing opportunity. But if there's a consistency to our minds through all of these, we're not going to be yanked all over the place. We're not going to have these extreme ups and extreme downs and everything in between. We're going to rather just be able to utilize whatever we meet as an opportunity to deepen our awareness of our own minds and our potential and the things we're trying to practice. Get rid of what's negative and increase what's positive. You look like you almost had your hand up, maybe? No? Do you have anything to share? Yeah? No? Okay. Anyone want to share anything? Yes.
I'm just curious about, you're saying developing the spaciousness. Is there a difference between developing or recognizing?
Yeah, I think if I use the word develop, it's maybe we're developing an awareness of that spaciousness of the mind. So it's actually like the spaciousness is always there to some degree because our minds are our minds. We tend to constrict and contract and confine them through our thinking and our processes that kind of supported within that narrowness. Whereas if we have a deeper awareness of the spaciousness of the mind, we can hang out in that spaciousness. And does that make some sense, or does that lead to other questions? Or okay, that's Pasha, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks, Pasha. Any other comments or questions? You have a chance for questions again later after the meditation and after I talk a little bit more on how to do this. I've given you some idea about how to do this already, but we'll spend a little more time. So the first thing, some practical advice that I've put together for this investigation of the spaciousness of the mind. Practical advice for making our awareness of the mind, and its spacious qualities much greater. We can say it's making the mind spacious, but at some level we're not as in answer to Pasha's question, we're not kind of trying to develop something that isn't there, but rather to become more and more aware of the vastness of our minds, of this quality that really is part and parcel of what we mean by mind. So the very first one is really to start small, and this is a bit of what we're going to look at this weekend. We work with simple experiences in our daily life. When we see that our mind is getting kind of squeezed and narrowed, the things that I was asking you to recall as a negative experience, an unpleasant experience. Start working with the small ones. Start working. What is it like when you get in your car and you start driving? I think everyone in the room probably drives. Maybe there's a few people who don't drive. Maybe you get on public transit and then you have to deal with all of that type of stuff. But whatever it is that you do, if you're, when you have those minor annoyances, those things that come up, what's it like to try to be aware of the spaciousness of the mind at that time, to make the mind more spacious, to be able to let go of those feelings of irritation, of annoyance, of whatever is going on. So this is a good place to start because, again, these are almost what we might call sort of mindfulness moments. Mindfulness is a big buzzword, right? And I think it's becoming less of a buzzword. Somebody told me that self-compassion is the new mindfulness. So I don't know. I mean, there's always some kind of trend when it comes to these sorts of spiritual ideas. But so maybe mindfulness is passé, but you're still going to need mindfulness, Mindfulness is actually one of the other things on my list, is that we really do need to cultivate a deeper sense of mindfulness, an ability to stay present with what's going on, and moreover, to use what's going on as a tool to do those things that I mentioned earlier, to diminish what's negative and to increase positive states, to broaden the awareness of the mind rather than constrict and tighten it. So mindfulness in this context is something that's developed through meditation. I think it's really hard to have full mindfulness without some sort of meditative practice where you're actually cultivating that non-forgetfulness with regard to being present with the meditation object and increasing that skill, because it really is a skill. Then you have something when you get off your cushion to actually use during your day, an ability to say, okay, now as I go about this task and that task and whatever I'm doing, I'm going to be more mindful, be more aware. And not just so that, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director, says, well, even a thief needs good mindfulness, or somebody who's like trying to do something really criminal. If they're not mindful, they're going to get caught, right? So there's no great value to mindfulness. It's what you do with your mindfulness. And what are you being mindful of? Being mindful of watching the states of mind that are arising, clearly identifying those that are constricting, tightening, negative, reinforcing those habits, and opening up to those that are different, that give us a different experience, that give us different options, that broaden the potential for us to have ways of being in the world that will be much more beneficial, again, for ourselves as well as for others. And that's our job of mindfulness. Mindfulness isn't mindfulness just, staying present with whatever's going on. It's being able to then guide the mind in the proper directions. And that, again, relies upon this idea of the mind being spacious. Because that tendency to tighten is what's going to cause the negative emotions to arise, and the negative emotions are going to tighten the mind more. As I said, they're circular, they're affecting each other. The tightness that we have in the mind causes those negative states to arise. The negative states keep the mind in that tightened place, even tighten it more. Look at how tight our minds are when I hate to tell people to do this, but think about when you were at your worst. It's not a pleasant experience, right? We probably have all had one moment in our life that we go, God, if I could just relive that moment and do something different and be different with whoever it was that I was with at that time, we would gladly do it because we're almost embarrassed to think about that moment. Well, think about how tight the mind had to be to get to that place, that kind of painful place. Well, if we had introduced some mindfulness, if we were aware that this whole spiraling down was starting, and we could clearly identify what was feeding into it and what would take it out of that into a broader perspective, well, then we'd do it. What's keeping us from doing it is not being aware. So the first point I was making again was to start small and to start with kind of introducing those sort of mindful moments into those little corners of your life, those little places where you see that it's something quite manageable. Managing something that is really strong in our minds can be hard right from the beginning because it's so strong. And this is again something I'll go into this weekend in terms of these harmful habits that we do have that become more deeply ingrained in us. And how do we unravel those? But for most of us, we need these kind of little victories. We need small places where we can start to taste what this is like, to be in that more spacious state, to be more mindful of what's happening in the mind so that we make conscious decisions about what sorts of thoughts we're introducing, what sorts of patterns we're creating. There's one thing about the mind, too, is it's very malleable, very changeable. And we just generally, and I'm speaking for myself here, in the past, I would be greatly under the control of those patterns. Got a little bit better now at trying to have some effect upon those. It's totally changeable. I love how also in science, neuroscience, in that they're finding this term, the neuroplasticity of the mind, right? Many of you know this term now. The idea is that, once more, that's a dual process as well. Both things, there must be a term for this. I'm not thinking of the adjective that describes this, that they're mutually influencing each other or something to that effect. That our mind, consciousness, influences the brain. And the brain influences consciousness. They work in tandem and have mutual effects on each other, but neither is, again, totally dictated by the other. So our mind can change the patterns that are going on, that are imprinted within our brains, that are there in our neurological stuff, everything that all the patterns that have been created within the brain. And those are reflections of what we've done with our minds. And they then influence the mind to have more of those same patterns, to continue to develop those habits. We can do this. I mean, it's great that science has kind of caught up with Buddhism to some degree, because the Buddha always said that you could do this. But, the Buddha wasn't so big on the brain. I mean, at the time of the Buddha, they didn't know much about, I'm sure they knew that there was this gray matter within the skull, but they didn't really know all the functioning of the brain at the level we know now. And of course, now there still isn't that much knowledge even of the functioning of the brain, but certainly much more than at the time of the Buddha. But the Buddha essentially said the mind is the key. And if you work with the mind, you can change these patterns. You can change the qualities that you're aware of, and this spaciousness, again, is part of that. Another interesting technique, which is also in Sogyal Rinpoche's book, the book I mentioned earlier that I read the frog story from, is this idea of recognizing the space between the thoughts. If we start to watch our minds, and all of you come on Wednesday nights to do a little bit, many of you on Wednesday nights to do a little bit of meditation, many of you also probably have your own meditation practice, and you start paying attention to what's going on in the minds, you can see that there are gaps. There are some periods where you can actually sense that there's a falling away of the thought processes before new thoughts arise. And you can start to hang out with those gaps and become more aware of the quality of mind as it's present when that is occurring. Now, why I'm saying that is because frequently we're blind to the spaciousness of the mind when we're thinking. When we're cogitating and sitting on our cushion, all we can think about is the grocery list that we want to put together so we don't forget things at the store, and something somebody said to us earlier in the day that's still bothering us, and something else that we're planning for or whatever. And we just keep going into these thought processes that are part of that narrowness and constricting as energy as well. I mean, we can also use thought to get into a broader perspective, but we tend to use it in that vein. But when there's a gap between the thoughts, and actually I think it's in Sogyal Rinpoche's book that he had a meditation master that said, if you want to know what meditation is like, well, see the gaps between the thoughts and just elongate that. And at some level, that's a bit of what we're trying to do. In any tradition, to some degree, thought is something we don't want to have going on in a crazy at-will way. In Tibetan Buddhism, we're definitely using more wholesome thoughts that we need to introduce as a very important tool to change our minds. Some Buddhist traditions try to do away with thought entirely, like kind of thinking, well, I'm just going to sit here in the space of not thinking. It's kind of hard to do that because we just have minds that are so used to thinking. But if we can begin to see that there are those gaps, there are those places that can be elongated, but at least in this context, we can also see that in those spaces, you can begin to become aware of the spaciousness of the mind. Suddenly the mind's not thinking, and you can be more in the experience of what the mind is, the experience of that vastness of the mind, the letting go of all that kind of tightness that thinking is about. So these gaps are kind of glimpses at that vast openness of the mind, that spaciousness of the mind. I'm not saying they're the complete answer, but they're a part of how we can influence this type of awareness, being aware of that spacious quality so that we don't constrict the mind, don't tighten the mind. We have more options about how we can be. Any questions so far in any of these? These making some sense? And you don't have to remember all of these. There's no quiz at the end. I don't do those. But it's nice if you do hear something that resonates for you, maybe just take note of it, and might be something that might be useful. But not everyone's going to say, "Oh yeah, that sounds good. I'll do that," and "Oh yeah, that sounds good." And I'm not expecting you to do all of these things or to necessarily feel like you can handle all these things. But yes,
you had said take the little annoyances, start there.
sure.
For instance, when you get in your car and something happens, or
Right,
you're on the
right.
bus, whatever, and do what?
Try to pull back into the idea that there is a consciousness that experience is arising within the sphere of. So you're having this annoying thing come into the sphere of your experience, but you're not going to tighten the mind around that and have your habitual response to it, which would honk your horn or start yelling and whatever. I'm not saying that you do that. I'm just saying some people do that. But rather try to pull back into the space of awareness. And we'll do a short meditation on this in a little bit. I'm going to talk for a little bit more, and then I want to do one more meditation and then have some room for questions at the end. But the idea is that if you begin to become aware at that time that this is something that triggers the mind in this way, but you're going to try to hold the awareness of the space in which that is arising, then you will potentially have greater options at doing something different. Because by looking at, I guess again, the idea behind this, looking at the spaciousness of the mind, is to say that when I'm in that realm of being aware of that, the mind isn't going to tighten. It's kind of like you're setting up a bit of a block to the mind going in these habitual patterns by keeping the mind spacious and keeping the awareness of the spacious quality of the mind. Maybe we'll get a taste of it when we do this exercise, this little meditation of a kind of sky-like mind. But if I'm not saying we should completely space out. Making the mind spacious doesn't mean spacing out, and so we end up kind of like just sitting there and we have an accident because we're not paying attention. Rather, it means your focus moves a bit from the experience of what you're having to what is the realm in which that experience is arising. What is the domain in which that's arising? And can I be aware of the spacious quality of the mind in the midst of all that happening, in the midst of me even making a decision or going here and doing that, doing this, doing that, whatever might be arising? It's just a slightly different level of awareness. So did that help at all, or does that lead to more questions? Yeah, no, thank you for bringing. What's your name again? Joanne, I think I met you last time, didn't I? Were you? I don't know, you look familiar. Everybody looks familiar these days. I see so many people when I'm out on the road. Anyway, thanks, Joanne. Any other questions so far? Yes.
We all say mindfulness, but does mindfulness simply mean awareness?
That's a good question. And your name is?
Miriam.
Marian. Marian's question is kind of a good one because actually the term mindfulness has been thrown around so much that there are actually some different meanings that you'll find in different traditions. At some level, awareness is a component of it, but frequently in this tradition we even use awareness to be equivalent to consciousness or mind. So we're talking about more a feature of that awareness, or a function, if you will, of that awareness. In Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, they've got a whole study of sort of Buddhist psychology and looking at the mind and the contents of the mind. And what they essentially say is that this thing we call mind or consciousness is sort of this larger sphere of awareness in that everything is happening in. And then you can pick apart all these various facets or features of the mind that are active at any particular time. Some of them active together, some of them can't be active together because they're contradictory. But mindfulness is one of those features of the mind. So what do we mean by mindfulness? In this tradition, we essentially mean a non-forgetfulness. Now that sounds like to define something by a negative is really kind of strange. But what we're saying is that you are then present and there I go using that word aware, present and aware of what is happening. And moreover, you are staying in line with what it is that you want to do. So that's the non-forgetfulness side of it, that you're not forgetting what it is that your mind should be doing at the time. I maybe shouldn't use this word should. I shouldn't use this word should. Just use it twice. But the idea is that we have to have an awareness of something, a mindfulness of something. Lama Zopa is really, it's kind of interesting when you get him talking about mindfulness. He says, mindfulness of what? Mindfulness is always of something. So we use the phrase sometimes mindfulness of the breath. Well, what does that mean? That means a non-forgetfulness with regard to staying present with the breath. So when we were doing the meditation to start tonight, I was encouraging you to stay with the breath, and if you see that the mind wanders from the breath, gently bring the mind back to the breath. And the idea being that your mindfulness is the factor of the mind that keeps you on the breath, keeps you aware that you're not going to forget the breath, that you're not going to forget the instruction that I gave you to stay with the breath. So in that way, it really means staying present and aware of whatever it is that you want as your focal point or as your how you're trying to work with the mind at that time. Lama Zopa in our tradition, he encourages us to have a mindfulness of all the kinds of qualities that we want to be developing. So, for example, if we're trying to be mindful of compassion in our lives, well then we meditate on compassion, but then when we get up off our cushion, we try to look at all beings through the eyes of compassion. We're always seeing them through that lens. So there's different traditions will talk about it in different ways. I think the more common way that it's talked about in some of the other meditative traditions of Buddhism are that it's sort of a non-judgmental awareness of whatever's arising. And again, that's in the light of teachers in our tradition, that's a little too vague. I mean, it's because as I said, I mean, if you're going to just sit there and go, "Oh, I'm just unconditionally present with my anger," well, what does that look like? I mean, I'm not putting that down in any way. I'm just saying, for me, as a term, it doesn't really get at what we mean by mindfulness in this tradition, because the mindfulness is the saying, okay, I can see anger is beginning to arise in my mind, and I can know that my mindfulness is saying, I'm not supposed to follow those thoughts. I want to introduce thoughts that will be more beneficial. So I can become aware of the more spacious quality of the mind, not tighten the mind into those habitual patterns of anger, and introduce other thoughts of loving kindness or compassion or other things. So mindfulness is like the tool by which all that process takes place. Well, it was a long-winded explanation, but thanks for asking that. Yeah, Marian. Yeah. Any other questions on that from that? Have you practiced any of the mindfulness types of trainings or? Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, it does seem like each tradition has a slightly different take on it, so.
Yeah. Yeah.
It gets a little, we make an assumption that everyone knows what that means, and then sort of.
Yeah. And I guess I made that assumption. I'm sorry. I'm glad you brought it up. That's the nice thing is, when people bring up points that I think can always help to clarify. So thanks for bringing that up. Any other comments on this so far? Okay. Let me add a few more points, and then we'll do a little meditation together because it's already 8:10. Another thing that we're going to go into this weekend, this was a nice topic to choose for tonight because it is introducing some of what the content will be for the weekend, is this idea of letting go of old stories. Frequently, when we kind of encounter something that can be disturbing or difficult or problematic for us, again, in quotes, because, as I said, they can often be opportunities as well, is that these old stories come in that really trap and confine us. Those old stories are a part of that tightness of the mind. I mean, each of us has our old stories, and we're all different, all individuals. We have things that have influenced us and our thinking from the past, ways that we were brought up to look at the world and to look at how we are to be in the world. We have all kinds of stuff that we can call old stories. Well, again, those old stories, I'm not putting any kind of value judgment on them. We have to look at them and say, are they getting us to the result that we want? Or are those old stories really trapping, confining, constricting us, causing us to go in those downward spirals and make the mind, too tight for any new stories to come in? I mean, Buddhism also has its stories. Don't get me wrong. We've got ways of looking at things, reframing things that are really, really useful, I think, from my own experience. But it's up to us to kind of open up to that possibility. So what's happening, we can go back to the, you're in your car or whatever, and you're encountering certain things on the road, accidents ahead of you or whatever's happening. The story that you might be telling yourself could even have to do with the fact that this shouldn't be happening, right? That's a big story we tell ourselves, right? That I shouldn't have to experience this. Somehow it's wrong that is getting in our way of our happiness, of our desire to get to work on time or whatever the case might be. Well, these are old stories that don't really allow for a possibility of looking at that situation in a very different light. What's a more positive way of looking at, oh, here's a traffic jam? Is there one? Yeah. Do you have a suggestion, Marian?
Oh,
Or,
no, sometimes I just pray
Yeah.
for a red light. Hey, red light. No, seriously, it's like, because sometimes, your traffic or whatever, it's like because we've come to a point of being still, and then I notice a hawk flying, right?
Right.
Like,
right.
wow, this is really neat. I would have missed that if I hadn't.
If you were just,
Yeah, and I know, so
Yeah.
people want to hurry through the intersection that turns yellow, it means put
Uh-huh.
on the gas pedal, but
Yeah.
it's like somebody like, oh, that's great, thank you, red light, I needed that because I need
Right.
to stop.
right. And that's a wonderful example. And it's Marianne, right? Yeah. Thanks, Marianne. Because I think that we don't recognize that there are some potentials for different experiences of those. We think that, oh, everybody treats a traffic jam or whatever's going on in the same way. That everybody's having this negative experience. We're totally justified in having that negative experience and getting angry and upset and honking our horns or whatever is going on. But we have another choice. We don't have to listen to that old story that says that this isn't how it should be, or that this is completely wrong and this is only negative. No, there's a positive side to it. This was a great example. It's a chance for you to practice patience, a chance for you to do a little mini meditation, a chance for you to send loving kindness and compassion to everybody in the cars around you who are having a similar experience. I mean, there's lots of opportunities in that moment, but you're closed to them when you listen to the old story, when you listen to the conditioning that you brought into that experience. So this is another way to kind of a tool. If you become aware that this story is going on, that you're following a pattern of thinking that you've bought into time and time again, to that in and of itself can be a recognition that there's another way to be, that the spaciousness can come out of just seeing it for what it is. It's sort of like you shone the flashlight on it, and now it's visible, and there's another option. There's another way that you can actually go about through your day. Another one that's kind of a little bit different, but is the idea that we are, as a culture, very busy in our lives, and I think this is the older you get. Maybe I've heard both stories. The older you get, sometimes the busier you get. Sometimes the older you get, the more you slow down and begin to appreciate and stop and smell the roses and all that kind of stuff. But I think we have to really kind of keep our busyness in check and our distractedness. As a culture, I think we're more distracted than any culture in the history of humanity. Have so many things that can just tug and pull us in so many different directions. So keep in mind that may be an obstacle to kind of getting in touch with that more spacious quality. Doesn't mean that you can't text within that spacious quality. I mean, I'm sure you can find a way to do that, because those aren't completely at odds. It's just the idea is that if we're going to let ourselves be run by all these things, once more, we're never going to have the ability to pull back and have a deeper awareness, to become more aware of that spacious quality of the mind. We do have this tendency, I think, to always feel like we need to be doing something. Alan Wallace, a really great practitioner in this tradition, he wrote a book called The Attention Revolution, and he says we all have attention deficit disorder. It's just a matter of degrees. And if we look at the culture we're in, we can see that this is a reality. We just have lots of stuff pulling our awareness here and there, and we need to develop a deeper sense of kind of pulling back away from that, so that we're not always caught up in that sense of busyness. I don't know if I want to talk about more about another one that we're going to look at on Friday night with this idea of learning to like problems, is to see problems as opportunities, which is all that we're going to explore. He says, this is Lama Yeshe again, he says, when our minds are narrow, small things agitate you very easily. So if we open our minds and hearts at that time, we can change the experience at that moment. So the idea is that, once more, any of these ways that we have of tightening the mind, if we can pull back and become aware of that, which does require, once more, these tools of mindfulness. But another tool that I want to introduce before we do a meditation is the idea that each of us kind of go about our day, and frequently we have things that happen to us that are positive, things that happen to us that are negative, and we may be successful in some ways and not successful in others. I really encourage you at the end of your day to do a little bit of an investigation. Take a look at what worked for you during the day, the ways that you were able to become a bit more aware of other options, kind of going to that more spacious dimension, having that awareness in whatever way it was, even with those small situations, those things that were just niggling things that happened that we were able to be a little different in, and give yourself kind of a round of applause and give yourself some credit. Really rejoice that you were able to do that. Have a way of kind of reviewing your day and giving yourself the impetus to do that again, kind of the encouragement to do that again. Secondly, when you're looking at your day and you're seeing, I really didn't do so well there. I just, I thought I was going to be more aware, and then I just started blah, blah, and everything went south, and it's a total mess. I really made a mess of it. So you made a mess of it. Try to think about what would be a useful way to look at that differently, or what sorts of tools you might use to become more aware of that spacious quality, and other things that you might introduce in the midst of that would change the experience. This is a bit more of what we're going to look at this weekend. Kind of how do we replace those negative tendencies with positive tendencies? Because as I said, that's the twofold part of our path. Buddhism is really good with giving us things to diminish the negativities, but there's a whole other side of it, which is increasing what is positive. So if you look at what went on during your day and you see, well, okay, I didn't do very well, and I was talking to that person, I just started getting really harsh in what I was saying, really critical, and I should have been more spacious and kinder in that moment. Well, then think about what sorts of thoughts might be useful if you meet that again. How would you reframe that? How would you look at that? And really meditate on it as if it's happening right now, and you were acting differently, saying something differently, thinking differently. Come from that spacious quality. Again, it's getting back in touch with the fact that we have the potential for the mind to do so much more than what we currently do with it. So this is an important part of our day, is to kind of look back and not just like go to bed and hope that we wake up the next day and it's going to be better. Well, it gets better because you actually spend some time looking at how to improve your life. What would you do differently? How would you encounter that in a different way? Some of you may have people that you see on a regular basis. Maybe they're the people you live with. And you have to deal with their energy and what they're saying and how they are. And you've been dealing with for so many years. You've gotten yourself into a story pattern. You've gotten yourself into a way of reacting. And there's the potential for you to be different. But if you never stop and take a look at it and say, okay, what would be a way of being different? Recognizing this spacious, more vast quality of my mind, what would it look like for me to just be present with what they're saying or doing and not allow that negativity to arise? What would it look like to be even more positive in the midst of that? to be more compassionate and caring and considerate and kind when they're being negative and what have you. So Buddhism is something that does require us to kind of take a look and see what would be different, what patterns do we want to change, and how would we change them. And then the next time we encounter it, we try it out. It's like an experiment. Buddha's big on experiments, Take these teachings, go out, see if they work. If they work for you, great. Then you keep investing in them and they become more and more powerful for you. If they don't work for you, by all means, the Buddha's not going to, be offended. I'm not going to be offended. Nobody's going to be offended. You have to find what works for you. But I have found through my own experience that if I apply these teachings in this way, then I am different. Then I am coming from a more spacious place. I'm able to hold, the appearance of a particular political figure on the television in a very different way than the way that I did before, Fill in the blank. He who shall not be named. Any questions before we do a little meditation? Yes, Marianne.
Well, I'm just thinking, I feel so fortunate that it's called a practice.
Yeah.
Because we get to practice. And so, because I have kind of a fierce inner critic that, at the end of the day, think, well, how could I have done it? And oftentimes my pattern was to beat myself up. And so how can I learn from this? And I think, I get to practice.
Yeah.
So kind of like, you can be more compassionate with yourself. Like, I really messed up. But, and so it's great. We get to just keep practicing.
Good. Thanks for pointing that out. It is really important to keep that perspective. One student I had in Santa Fe, she was funny. She said, they have that phrase that practice makes perfect, but in her experience, practice makes practice. And I like that phrase so much better because why are we holding ourselves up to that ideal of making ourselves perfect? That's just practice makes practice. We just keep practicing and new avenues of practice unfold when we practice in particular ways. There is an end of the line in Buddhism, don't get me wrong, but let's not think about that as much as just doing the work, making it into a practice, not taking ourselves that seriously, not making it a competition, not judging ourselves. We're going to look at some of these patterns this weekend too, because they're a big one in the West, Anyway, any other comments? All right, before we do a meditation, you've all been sitting for a little bit, so maybe stand up and just take like a stretch break, whatever you need to do to get yourself kind of in a little bit more alert space. I'm going to do the same, and then we'll do a short meditation together. Okay. So I know it's hard meditating at night. We've all had full days, but again, keep in mind those things. If you've studied meditation and meditation posture, there are some things we can do with our posture to make ourselves more alert and awake. As I pointed out earlier in terms of posture, that having the back straight is one of them. And we can see in looking at somebody, if somebody's sitting like this, it's very different energy than somebody like this, right? So this is something that if we pay a lot of attention to, it'll be helpful in terms of keeping the mind alert and awake. But also the eyelids. As I mentioned in the earlier meditation, it's suggested that you keep the eyelids slightly open, just allowing a little bit of light, just the eyelids open a crack, and then having that downward gaze. And you're not focusing on anything in particular. You're just simply keeping the eyes kind of open, having a soft focus to them. But if this is uncomfortable for you, you're certainly welcome to close the eyes, but just keep in mind that's what we do when we lay down to go to bed. So there may be a tendency for the mind to get a little sleepy. And then I won't go over all the other elements of posture, but just pay attention to your posture. Make sure there is this uprightness to the body and the back, but also a relaxation. Letting go of any tension that might be blocking kind of a nice flow of energy and awareness in the body and the mind. And we'll do a few minutes, as we did earlier, of focusing on the breath. So as I said earlier, if you have a technique that you use usually with the breath, there's a number of points where you could focus on the breath, or sometimes people just hold a general awareness of the breath, kind of the body breathing. Any of these are fine to work with. I sometimes, particularly in the evening, use the sensation at the tip of the nose because it kind of brings my awareness up in the body to that point. And in that case, you just stay present with that sensation at the tip of the nose as you inhale and as you exhale. And whenever you notice that the mind has wandered, then you simply let go of that distraction and bring your mind back to the breath. Again, so going back to that term mindfulness, this is a mindfulness of the breath, meaning that we're not going to forget that instruction as best as we can. But not beat ourselves up if we do forget it, but simply do our best to stay present with that sensation at the tip of the nose, or again, however you're working with the breath. So I'll ring the chime. We'll do this in silence for a few minutes, and I'm going to lead you into a little investigation of this spacious quality of the mind, kind of the clarity, vastness of our consciousness. So we're going to begin by generating an image in our minds of this spacious clarity of awareness, consciousness, mind. Imagine that you're lying on the top of a hill with an unobstructed view. No trees, no buildings. And you are gazing up into a clear blue sky. No clouds, no pollution, no planes, nothing obscuring that. Just simply the vastness of the clear blue sky. And focus your awareness on this luminous spaciousness. If you can, allow yourself to merge with this clear, luminous space. Imagine your body and your mind, as well as the surrounding environment, becoming one with this pure empty space. Becoming empty, luminous, clear, without any sense of separation or duality. Just oneness with this vast, clear spaciousness. Just try to hold your awareness in the experience of this empty, luminous space. Just that. Without thinking this, thinking that, without any judgments or discrimination. This is the clear, pure nature of your mind. Just rest in this space with intense but relaxed awareness. And when thoughts and emotions arise from this space, try not to engage with them. Do not gravitate towards them with attraction or push them away with aversion. Simply watch them arise, abide, and dissolve back into empty spaciousness. Just like clouds in the sky that might appear, but then gradually disappear. Hold your awareness of the space in which all of this arises. Everything that arises, thoughts, emotions, feelings, sensations of sound, touch, sight, and so on, all of these have the nature of spacious, luminous clarity, formless, space-like, clear awareness. They are rising within the pure nature of your consciousness. And try to hold that awareness, simply observing what arises, but not getting attached to it. Continually bring your awareness back to the clarity of the mind, that space-like quality. If you see the mind tightening or constricting around anything that arises, just try to pull back into that awareness, that vast spaciousness of mind, totally relaxed. Try to stay with that experience. And within this awareness, just gently bring the mind back to the breath, whatever way you were working with the breath. And from that spaciousness, just simply hold your awareness of the breath as you inhale, as you exhale. Does anyone want to share anything from that meditation? Did that give a little flavor for that? Joanne, right? Yeah. A little bit, maybe? Maybe not.
I didn't think about it.
You didn't think about it. Well, that's maybe a good thing.
Let's try and tap into this. So something that I've been working with
Right.
is the idea that the mind isn't up here.
Right. Right.
And so that was what I was working with almost the whole time, was trying to have it be everywhere and not all
Right.
up here. I was even thinking about being one with everybody. But it was up here. It was above everybody's heads.
Was it?
I was trying to just
Trying to bring it down, yeah.
Yeah.
It's okay. Slowly, slowly. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes. What's your name?
Rosemary.
Hi, Rosemary.
For me, it was really useful to have this music. You know, like the playlist of songs I don't like.
Yeah, I actually asked them to play those during. No.
It's useful because then when I stepped back into that bigger space, there was room for it to be there. And there was even room for it to be there, and I was aware of still not liking it, but it wasn't as annoying.
Perfect. Thanks, Rosemary. Actually, yeah, I was having the same experience. I don't know if I found this song quite as annoying as the off-key singing. Is it like a karaoke thing or something? Or I don't know. Amateur musicians, okay. Oh, I'm sure they'll be really good one day. But no, I think that there was some usefulness, I agree, to kind of having that come up, because it gave you a chance to say, okay, you're not just sitting here in a safe little bubble of meditation working with this idea. What is it like to be with something that comes into your field of experience that might be challenging for some of us? And maybe some of you loved it and just thought it was wonderful sounds or whatever. But, to see, well, what's it like to have that spacious quality? So it worked for you then?
It did, and
Yeah.
also the idea that, well, I think it was useful to do it here because there wasn't anything else that was distracting me particularly. You know, it wasn't like I was trying to do this while I was driving and the music was playing. It was just like it was
A safe
a
place.
safe,
Yeah.
an easy way to
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah. Good. Thanks, Rosemary. Yeah. There was a hand over here, perhaps, or no? Anyone else? Any other insights? Yes, Sally.
It was pretty cool to be on the top of the hill, and it was just like the whole sky was open, and I kind of almost like floated up and dissolved in it. But when the music started, it was really helpful because all of a sudden I kind of gathered up the music and put it down here in this little corner, and it was like there was still tons of room left.
Right.
And this one annoying thing was just a speck. It was just a little thing over there.
Sure. That's a really great way to put it. Yeah. You know, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I think this was in, some of you have seen this teaching that's called Ethics for a New Millennium. He ended up writing a book that was an extension of that particular public talk. And His Holiness, I'm pretty sure the way he exhibited this, I always do this, and I have to go back and watch it one day to make sure I'm doing it right. But he says, like, if this is what your mind is like, everybody can say, I've just got this little hole in my fist, right? If that's what your mind is like, then put my tip of my finger in that space, and it takes up the entire thing. You know, it just completely fills it, right? So if your mind's not like what Sally's saying, and you're just totally focused on this annoying sound that is totally in my field of awareness, and it takes up the entire space, it's because you've narrowed your mind to such a tight little range that it fills it entirely. There's no space for you to do anything different, right? But if you have the spacious quality, and His Holiness just kind of opens up to like the reality of the room, I think they were in the Royal Albert Hall or something in London, like that, the mind's that big, well then the tip of my finger is pretty insignificant, right? It's like the little noises that you just put in the corner, because there's places where you can put those and you don't feel like they're the totality of your experience at the time, because you have that spaciousness you can hang out in. Good. I'm glad you...
A little sense of gratitude that it wasn't rap.
Yeah. I always like to use music as the example of why things don't have any particular inherent qualities, because it's such a subjective thing, right? Because there are people in the room who love rap, I'm sure, and there are people in the room who hate classical or love classical or hate jazz or love jazz or whatever, and it's just, you know, we each have our own little, again, storyline that we tell about those particular things, our own predispositions. So yeah, it's but it's great that you pointed that out. I think it's really good that you have that ability. When the mind's spacious, things aren't just filling up the entirety of it. We've got so much more room. Yes, Pasha.
Actually, the music for me, I enjoyed it.
Good.
And I noticed some attachment to it, like focusing on it, but it also expanded my my mind. Because the sound, I couldn't locate where it's coming from.
Right.
So it's coming from that location, but there was no centralized point.
Right.
You know, so it just expanded a whole bunch.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I noticed the attraction, I would just focus on it. And then when I'd go back, you know, the space would open up and I would kind of hear it in the background as well.
Yeah.
But
Good.
yeah, it was a little bit more enjoyable for me.
Good. And that's perfectly fine. Again, that shows that there's nothing kind of one way or another. It's all our own interpretation. And, you know, and at some level, if we pull back into that space, we can simply hear it as sound. It's just sound arising. Just like, again, we look at the clouds, we don't sit there and go, oh, that's a good cloud, a bad cloud, or whatever cloud. It's just a cloud. It's just going through the sky. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out, Pasha. It's great to have all these different experiences of this. Anyone else? Yes, Dal.
So, I heard the music, and I heard that it was off key. Irritating. So I wasn't focusing on myself in my meditation, I was focusing on the music. And then I made up the story that they were singing, I can't help but falling in love with you.
Right.
And wow, that's where I am right now. And that's what this is all about, is falling in love with me. And so it was like, it really helped me with my meditation.
Wonderful. Yeah. I wish I could take credit for all that. No, maybe I don't. But no, I think that's great, Dal. Yeah. But once more, I think that's another example of how when you're in a bit more of a spacious state, you can interpret things in a more positive way, rather than honing in on what it is that we find unpleasant or negative or irritating. There's a potential to see it in a different light. This is again what we're going to look at on Friday night when we talk about changing our view of problems, difficulties, suffering into something that's actually quite useful. And then over the whole weekend when we go into all of our habits that are really just simply ways that we have of framing and looking at the world that can all be changed, because it's really up to us to determine what's a good experience, what's a bad experience. I don't know. Any other comments on this? These have been great comments. I thank you all for sharing. So, is there any other final questions or, again, I'm open to whatever anybody has to say about this. Let me just review real briefly then kind of what we've looked at. First again was this idea of the spaciousness of the mind is part of that quality that sort of takes us up and out of our negative patterns where the mind is all constricted and tight. And if we start to pay attention to this and we introduce a spacious quality, it can become a means for keeping us from going to those negative places and allowing the flourishing of more positive attitudes. And the tools that I gave you to work with that, again, weren't maybe as specific as what you might like, but it really does come down to us being able to maintain a mindfulness, a presence with what's happening, and an introduction of different thought patterns, different ways of looking at things, within the space of understanding that there's a lot of potential in that sort of gaps between the thoughts, the ability for us to reside in that space of spacious awareness. And that's what I hope you got a taste for in the meditation as well, is kind of the ability to be able to pull into that. You know, and you might recall if that worked for you, like Sally said, of the idea of laying on a hilltop, looking out at the vastness of a sky. Maybe we haven't done that enough in our lives. Probably did a lot when we were kids, but I don't know, how often does an adult go up and sit on a hilltop and just look at the sky? You know, maybe we all need to do that. But if you can bring that, or whatever image works for you. As I said, Lama Yeshe used the term ocean. I find oceans to be a little more, I don't know, the spaciousness of the sky works better for me. Nonetheless, some people may like that idea of the vastness of the ocean and being in the depths of the ocean and everything just going out in all directions around them. And there, it's like the fish or whatever are going through the water are just like these thoughts. But we're going to maintain the awareness of the vastness of the ocean. But if you can introduce those sorts of thoughts at those times, you see that there's more options for you. There's more choices about how you want to be in the world. And you can see a song that's being played in a different light and hear the words and make something positive out of it. Whereas if you're only in that tightness of finding it annoying and irritating, it's probably not going to have that potential. And we'll be exploring this more as we go through the remaining sessions. So, all right, let's just have a few thoughts then to conclude tonight. In Buddhist terms, we call this a dedication, but essentially what we mean is kind of a punctuation mark, if you will, at the end of this sentence that we've been engaged in from the beginning of the evening. All of the thoughts that have occurred, everything that we've heard, all the words that we've shared, anything that we've planted in terms of seeds within our minds that will give rise to a deeper, happier experience for ourselves as well as for others. We kind of seal all that energy, make sure that it brings forth the greatest possible result for all beings. And just really hold that thought. And if you want, you can even visualize within this vast spaciousness, sending out that positive potential, all those seeds that you planted, all the positive energy you've created, and think that it touches every being. Just goes out in all directions in the vast spaciousness of the sky. Okay, thank you all very much. Appreciated this opportunity to be with you. So, good.